Hey everyone, it's your Conjugate Cartel Capo here. And before we dive into today's topic, make sure to find me over on Instagram as Coach Mark Estrello. I offer one-to-one coaching. It's what I do full-time and the odds are very good. I'd love to work with you. With that being said, let's get into it. All across the nation, they've been cheering for this guy. Over and over, you hear it. Let's go, Brandon. Okay, really lame post-election joke aside, we are going to be talking today about my athlete Brandon and his first Strongman show and how we set him up for success. Let's talk a little bit about the man behind the program and what we did for him. So Brandon himself, he is a very experienced lifter. He's been lifting, I think, for almost 20 years now. So well over 10 years, as I have listed here in the slide. And he was just fresh off of a 12-week powerlifting program we had wrapped up together. In terms of where he was at going into prep for his first Strongman show, very high levels of static strength. Main thing I wanted to focus in was his skill with getting his strength to carry over to the implements themselves. You take a strong bench presser, for example, the log, they're going to have an easy enough time pressing it. It's getting it into place and learning how to apply leg drive, for example. That'll be their bottleneck versus just raw pressing power. Ultimately, I didn't have too many concerns or reservations with him. He wasn't inhibited in movement to any large degree. Very quick, adept learner. The only thing we really wanted to lock in on was his deadlift, as he used to pull sumo. In this event, the show coming up, it was going to be a max frame deadlift, so we needed to bring his stance in and have him learn that technique. As far as the show itself, the events were a log and sandbag press medley. So you just go log, sandbag, back and forth. A Hercules hold, the max frame deadlift, as I had mentioned before. A chain yoke run, and then a stone pick. You waddle a few feet, load it over the bar series. So ultimately, very well-rounded show. It's one of those type of events where you couldn't just cruise on static strength because you did have those more dynamic events, especially the chain yoke. If you've ever worked with one of those, they are extremely squirrely and finicky. Now, in terms of what I was looking at, my number one priority was going to be building his upper back. And then he did have limited equipment access, and then he had roughly 16 weeks to prep for this show. Now, as far as that previous 12-week powerlifting block we had run, he did hit some really big PRs there. We added 25 to his squat, we added 10 to his already impressive bench, and then 40 pounds to his deadlifts. 75-pound total PR across 12 weeks. And this was done using a pretty traditional 4-day split with block periodization. Changing over to Strongman, there were quite a few changes I wanted to make sure we could maximize his odds of success at the show. Number one is we switched him right over to conjugate. Reason being, Strongman is an inherently conjugate sport. There you have to improve multiple dimensions at once on a weekly basis as an athlete to be successful at the high level. You can't just be strong. You can't just be well conditioned. You have to have both elements to be successful. Otherwise, what will happen is while you might crush it in one event, you're going to get eaten alive in the others. And every single event is worth the same amount of points unless you're at a world's qualifying selection group, in which case sometimes the stones wind up counting for double, which is just silly, but hey, that's another conversation entirely. Now, by running conjugate, what this allowed me to do as well is we could break it up into shorter little 3, 4, 5 week microcycles where we could make adjustments within them based off emerging patterns we saw. We could see, oh, his triceps needed more love. Oh, upper back needed more love. Oh, X, Y, or Z movement generated an inordinate amount of fatigue, so we want to reduce it in the next training wave or swap it out entirely. Much like you see in a lot of my programs, we had our developmental and intensive days, with the intensive days being our analog for max effort, but we rarely used 1 rep maxes in this program, as we wanted to use the intensive days to develop muscularity and skill to support higher peaks of development from his developmental days, which centered around the frame deadlift as well as the event pressing and just the moving work. And as always, lots of upper back work because for Strongman, you need a thick, strong upper back. It helps in the press, it helps in the deadlift, it helps with moving events all around the board. If you're going to be successful in Strongman, you can't go wrong by doing more upper back work. Now, with respect to training the press, one of our big challenges right off the bat was that Brandon did not have access to a 12-inch log week in, week out. However, he did have an 8-inch log. And if you've worked with the 2 different logs before, in general, you'll find that smaller logs are more difficult to clean but substantially easier to press because you can adopt a better rack position. So we did a lot of our work on the 8-inch log. Every now and again he would travel out to another facility to make use of a 12-inch log, and we found that the more difficult rack position did not disrupt him too much. Reason being, we did all that upper back work, so he was able to get that nice thoracic extension without overarching the low back and losing position and thus losing his leg drive. Now, in terms of training the press on our intensive or max effort days, what we did is we selected different variations that would develop different attributes of his press. Starting off, we opted for a neutral grip or Swiss bar push press. Reason being, this is again a close enough situation, and it allowed him to get some work done using leg drive with a large, kind of thicker bar that puts the weight further out in front of him alongside a neutral grip. This has a lot of transference to the log. You'll see a lot of athletes use it, even if they do have access to a log, just as a supplemental movement. So this was our first wave movement. Then after that, we moved to a strict log press just to get him working it twice a week, get used to that rack position, get used to that necessary layback that you find in a good log press. Then our third variation we used was an axle push press. Reason being, we just wanted to get more front rack position without the log, as well as introduce more leg drive. You'll generally find that the log, you don't use as much leg drive as you do versus a push press. Think about your best strict press with an axle versus your best push press with an axle, and compare and contrast that to your best strict log versus your best push log. The log numbers tend to be a little bit closer just because the log rapidly bottlenecks leg drive. So by using an axle to learn leg drive mechanics, it'll transfer over more readily to the log push press. Not so much in raw weight, but in that skill transfer of leg drive. Then after that, as we neared the end of our training phase and we were approaching the show, log work was getting very heavy on his developmental days as well as the deadlift work, so I switched him over to a seated 50-degree incline press for the next little phase. And the reason why is I look at this as kind of a Swiss Army knife for the strongman athlete. Anywhere between 50 to 70 degrees on the incline is a really good pressing incline for the strongman athlete because it emulates the layback that you would see in a log press without making inroads against low back recovery, and just builds that raw, static pressing power. And then last but not least, our final press variation was a seated strict press with no back support. And again, this just builds static strength, but also what it does is because of the position, it forces a very large degree of T-spine extension. So while you're not creating a ton of low back fatigue, you're still training that layback and learning how to create that layback while relying on your upper and mid back to hold you in place. And that layback is so essential for a strong log press. So that's how we attacked intensive days. Now, with respect to his developmental days, we used a lot of complexes such as 3 cleans to 3 viper presses to 3 push presses, just getting him used to that roll-up phase. Because as I mentioned earlier, he had and still has, a very high static strength element, so we needed to focus in more on the skill side of things. And complexes like that, they punish you for limping into them. And I do believe personally the log should be taken aggressively and it should be snappy. And again, for Brandon too, because he is very athletic, that acceleration-based developmental wave treated him very well. And as the weeks went by, we moved to a more standard, strength skills, strength speed development where we might do 6 doubles and then fatigue singles thereafter. And then it was only about the last 4 or 5 weeks we really had him start playing with the sandbag press. And the reason why is my priority was making sure that the log went well. With how the event was set up, if you couldn't do the log, you weren't allowed to switch over to the sandbag, and you had to start on the log. So it made more sense to put our energy there. Now, with respect to the deadlift training, it was a max frame deadlift, so all we had him do was use a trap bar and elevate it so it was at the same height as it would be at competition. First week, all we had him do is work up to a challenging weight, and then after that, we ran a very basic block periodized thing. He'd work up to a heavy double one day, do some speed triples, then the next block he'd work up to heavy singles, and then do speed doubles. We also made heavy use of bent over row variations to build his upper back, as partial deads require a lot of upper back work, and then the rows also have transference to stone loading. Again, we see how the accessory work can help us improve multiple events at once, just by targeting the relevant muscle groups and getting them strong in the positions necessary. Side note here, his first session with this, he topped out at about 560, and come competition day, he pulled 850 on the frame, so we made a lot of progress on this one, needless to say. Now, as far as training for the events, Brandon was able to travel out to Untamed Strength once or twice a month to practice on the implements proper. Otherwise, much like with the log, we used a lot of close enough type movements to help build the positions and muscles relevant to the event outright. So for example, in the Hercules hold, we did a lot of grip work, delt isolation, and again, upper back work. And towards the end of the training cycle, we introduced suitcase barbell holds like Ed Cohen would do. These obviously are a great oblique builder, but they also build a ton of grip and forearm endurance, which really paid off for him when we go into his results. Then for the chain yoke, we did a lot of loaded marches, and one of them that we used in particular was a Zercher march. Of course, you'd think, load it up on your upper back march in place, that is a great option. But by doing it with a Zercher hold as well, what this allowed us to do was it trained him to have his hips stacked underneath his shoulders. That way he wasn't overextended with his hips behind, creating a ton of torque and force in his low back that would cook him in the yoke and thus impede him later down in the competition. So that's something to consider, is adding in movements like that are, again, really close to it. If someone's good at the Conan's wheel, they tend to do all right on the yoke. They're very superficially similar positions because we're training a movement of the lower body while maintaining a relatively rigid upper body, especially in the midline, right? We just keep that weight over center balance. So a lot of marches in place. We did walking lunges with short strides as well, just to help build that unilateral leg strength and hip movement. And then squatting for leg strength, doing stuff like front squats, high bar back squats, just building powerful legs coupled with the upper back and a rigid midline, transferred over really nicely to the chain yoke. So then on those days that he did get to touch it, he wasn't too out of his wheelhouse, and it was a skill thing we had to work on rather than pure strength. And then as far as the stones go, we would do sandbag complexes. We'd have him do a few rows with it, lap it, go into extensions, carry with it, anything like that, just to build the upper back, especially a rounded upper back with a rigid midline. We actually used a sumo deadlift as a lower body max effort variation early on in the training cycle, because if you do look at the initial pick of the Atlas stone, it's a quasi-sumo position. You'd obviously want to use a narrower sumo stance. Additionally, we did use the sumo deadlift early on to help build hip strength. That way it would carry over to the yoke down the road. And then a snatch grip RDL, just one of the best all-around posterior and upper back developers you can be doing. And if we again look at the position of the Atlas stone, it tends to be fairly wide, and it is a quasi-RDL to get it off the floor. And one more shout out to Zercher work, because we're building that rigid midline with a rounded upper back, just like in the snatch grip RDL. And if we look at the position of the Atlas stone, there's a fair bit of bicep recruitment. Not that we want you curling the stone, but we do want to think of having those tendons strong and resilient. The Zercher allows for that. So do more Zercher work. Now what we have here is a sample week of what Brandon's training looked like later on in the training cycle. So for day one was his lower max effort day. We did an SSB back squat to a heavy 8. Again, we're just building that leg strength. And for Brandon, he's a very good squatter, so he can get away with a bit more intensity and volume versus someone like myself. My squats aren't the cleanest, they need a little bit of work. So my skill element inhibits my strength element. Whereas with Brandon, because his skill element is so high, we can push the strength element without generating too much fatigue. Then after the squat, we would do some good mornings, then a Zercher reverse lunge, and Dimmel deadlifts. Now, if you're not familiar, a Dimmel deadlift and RDL superficially look the same. Main difference with the Dimmel is they're done lighter and for very high reps, and it's almost a drop into the bottom where you're kind of forcing yourself to catch the weight and reverse it. And the reason we did so many Dimmel deads was to build that upper back, because it's, again, that sudden kind of, you have to absorb the force and redirect it. It's also really good for his glutes, hamstrings, and hip strength. It also built a little bit of conditioning, had a little bit of passive grip work. Even with straps, you got to think you're working your grip to a certain degree. And then a Zercher march. Then our second day was a static pressing day, where we did an incline press. We worked up to a heavy triple. Then we did some pull-ups. We did these jettison style, where he would do 4 weighted, then let go of the weight and do rep out with just body weight. Now, the reason we had the pull-ups here was they're good for stretching out the lower back, builds the upper back strength, and again, we get a little bit of grip. Funny enough, he actually got a muscle up during his competition prep. Wasn't even intentional, but he managed to land one, so hey, fantastic. Then ring dips. Reason for the ring dips is really good for pecs, and a strong upper chest creates more purchase for the log. So you get a good rack position, so it helps with your press. It also helps, again, having strong pecs with the chest fly phase, if you will, that bear hug of the Atlas stone, as well as the sandbag, getting it into place to press. Then we would do a chest supported row variation, just done rest pause style, because at this point in the workout, we wanted to simplify things a little bit, and a chest-supported row would also reduce low back fatigue going into an off day. Then after the off day would be his deadlift day, which We'd warm up the hips and everything with some pause squats, hit our deads. Then we would do a barbell row and shrug pairing. I really like this superset because you're just hitting the whole upper back in one quick go. And in general, if you can improve your barbell row, it's going to have a lot of carryover to your deadlift. A good all-around Swiss Army knife movement. Early on in his training cycle 2, we actually did the barbell rows with a snatch grip just to help get more rear delts involved. And then day 4, this was a lot of log and sandbag work. This was our event day. We do a lot of complexes, time domain stuff. So for example, in 12 minutes, I might have him work up to the best 2 clean, 2 push press he could do on the log, then drop it by 10% and do 3 additional rounds of 3, for example. We might just set a timer for 20 minutes, have him do a triple on the log, a triple pressing the sandbag, just kind of moving back and forth. So you can see how across the week, what we're doing here is we're training every single event, but he's not necessarily 100% fresh going into any given training session, which is by design because you're not going to be 100% fresh in a strongman show, which is why we did start his week, for example, off with a lower max effort as opposed to his log push press. Side note here, don't get it twisted. There is certainly something to be said for training at 100% freshness every now and again for certain shows, for certain events that need more priority. You just have to be mindful of where you are on your recovery spectrum and how certain events fatigue you. This was a decision I made based off of what I'd seen Brandon do and how he recovers from his work. To me, this made the most sense, and especially it being his first show, fatigue is one of those things that creeps in across multiple events, so I wanted him never to quite be at 100% in training. That way he wouldn't be drowning in deep water come competition day. Now, if this programming sounds a little bit dumb to you, I'm going to quote my debate coach. He always said, "It's only dumb if it doesn't work." So how did it work out for Brandon? Pretty gosh darn well. Event number 1 was the 220 log and 200-pound sandbag press medley, press 1, press the other, back and forth, back and forth. Brandon got 5 total reps, which was good for 3rd place. Our second event was at 506-pound chain yoke. Brandon landed 81 feet, took 1st place with a substantial margin. I want to say 2nd place was somewhere around 60 feet. Third event was the max frame deadlift. He tied for 1st place here with 850 pounds on the max frame deadlift. And I think on another day when he was fresh, he might have gotten that 890, which would have been the next weight jump. Then it was Hercules hold, 42 seconds. He won this again by a substantial margin. I want to say 2nd place was somewhere around 34 seconds, so big overperformance there. Then last but not least, it was a stone series that went 240, 260, 290, and I believe 340. Don't quote me on that last one. You pick them, run them, load them over a bar. He got 3 stones in 41.97 seconds, which was good for 2nd place on the event. So if you look at his performance across the board, the events that he won, generally he won by a substantial margin, except for the deadlift, which, hey, it's the deadlift. That can be really tough, especially when there are mandatory jumps. And when your worst finish overall is 3rd place, that means you're very well-rounded. And it's one of those things, to be successful in strongman, especially at a high level, you cannot have weak links. All you can have is certain things you're better at, but everything needs to be a strength. Final result, he took 1st place, 31.5 points. And for reference, 2nd place wound up with 29.5 points. So that means he was very secure and strong going into the stones, which is exactly what you want. So it did not come down to the stones, but he certainly rose to the occasion. And as we look back on his training, truthfully, there isn't too much I would change in retrospect outside of him having access to the equipment more regularly. Brandon is a really great athlete. He's very communicative. He adapts. He learns very quickly. And what's nice about that is because he learns so quickly, we can extract more benefit from a given exercise in less time. Someone who takes a little bit longer to learn a new movement, instead of a 3-week wave in conjugate, we might run 5-week waves. That said, sometimes you might run 5-week waves just because you're getting so much from the movement. It's all based off of feedback and how the lifter is adapting, as well as how the program is adapting to the lifter. So Brandon was just exceptional all across the board. He's planning on competing again in the future. I'm not going to spoil the surprise. He can, talk about that if he wants to on his social media. And our key takeaways for him is using variations that build muscle and position that are relevant to the events at hand when you do not have event access. Close enough is better than nothing. You're better off getting close and working very hard at that than overanalyzing and worrying about it and not executing on some form of plan. And last but not least, Zerchers are criminally underrated. You should be doing more of them. They're just a great all-around variation. And this is how we managed to take Brandon from never competing at a show. And after the first event, he was known as the sleeper pick because boy, did he wake up and win the whole thing. So Brandon, congratulations again. And can we get a let's go Brandon in the comment section? Folks, I'll catch you next time. Hope you're having a great day. I'll see you soon.